One final point on operations. I've already said the EU won't fight wars, but it may undertake not just more operations in the future, and not just more autonomous operations in the future, because of course some of them have been with NATO's help. They may start getting larger. Most EU operations, frankly, have been very small. Our largest was 7,000. NATO's commanding 70,000 plus. The UN commands 16,000 in Congo. But if the EU has to respond to larger, more dangerous crises in the future, and partly because the US doesn't want to or cannot because of other commitments, it may be that our operations start getting larger. Now, to give a concrete example, there were a number of member states in 2006 who wanted to send a peacekeeping force to the Israeli-Lebanese border. And if you look at that UNIFIL force, the UNIFIL II force, the UN force, it's predominantly made up of Europeans. And it's 10,000 plus, and it's in a very dangerous environment. Because the thing about peacekeeping is, while so far on the 6 EU operations, we have not been politically challenged because we've only had one casualty on the military operations, as far as I'm aware, and that was in Chad. But of course, if you're in, peacekeeping can easily become very dangerous, as we've seen in Afghanistan, as we've seen in Lebanon, as we saw in Somalia in the 1990s. So I think that may be a key test, a political test in the future. Now, I'm going to finish up because I think I've spoken enough. There's a lot of things I didn't talk about because, of course, a lot will depend on our relationship with the United States and how we understand each other's priorities and interests. A lot will depend on our relationship with Russia. Russia may be a nuisance or it may become a very constructive partner, or maybe both. A lot will depend on how we relate with Turkey. Imagine if Turkey were a member of the EU, say within the next 20 years. Imagine how that changes our strategic picture. We could be bordering an Iraq, well, it may not even exist in the way we understand it today, a nuclear-armed Iran, a collapsing Syria. It completely changes our strategic picture if Turkey becomes a member of the European Union. So those are all key questions that need to be thought about. But I think the biggest short-term problem is, frankly, defense policy is not very important today in Europe. Now, you could argue that's a very good thing. You could argue that's a sign of success. But I think most member states, frankly, are weary of peacekeeping. They're tired of it, especially because of their experiences in Afghanistan. They're also about to face huge cuts in some member states, 10, 20, 30, even 40%, I understand, in Bulgaria in the defense budget. These are massive cuts, which will obviously impact on capabilities. And quite simply, it's not easy to answer the question for a politician, what is defense policy for today? What are military forces for today? Especially when people are far more worried about their jobs. If you talk to people about security policy, they want to know about jobs. They want to know about climate change. They want to know about immigration. Those issues are much higher on the political agenda today than defense or international security policy. At least looking at the EU as a whole, I think that's the biggest problem. And while I've tried to make a strategic case and try to describe a future strategic environment and why I think EU defence policy will become more active and more important for all of us, the fact is the political case at the moment is extremely weak. Thank you very much.
Good day. I'm Andrus Voivoda, Minister of Defense. I was a member of this house as a student some time ago, but still it's very good to be back home. I have a few questions. Well, the first question was a remark at first. When I heard you speaking as an Irish, I understood and I was ready to argue that Lisbon Treaty leaves an open doors for a common defense. And it says that common defense would be eventually a common policy of the member states if they decide so. So, as we read in the Ministry of Defense, which is a very, very bureaucratic institution, as you imagine, we read this very simple, that is a kind of, Article 5 security guarantee, the potential of the Article 5 kind of security guarantees, which in our mind, would duplicate NATO security guarantees. But when you were talking as a EU-sponsored analyst, which was a bit different from your Irish perspective. You were talking what I was planning to say to you as a remark. So my first question would be, would you imagine Ireland being more keen on home defense, on territorial defense of the EU in a long-term perspective? And the second question would be about upcoming EU trio presidency. As you all know, Lithuania will be EU president of the EU Council in 2013. And we have this trio presidency together and along with the Ireland and Greece. So my question would be, what would be possible common issues for Ireland, Lithuania, and Greece drafting the common presidency program, which is a bureaucratic, of course, exercise, to draft a program for common security and defense policy, but still, it will be a challenge for those three states, to manage somehow to find those common issues in the European security and defense policy that would lead through those year and a half in 2012 to 2013, 2014. So that would be to my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those questions. They're excellent questions. Makes my job really easy. Now, on common defense in the Lisbon Treaty, you answered the question actually with your question, because you said that the article says there will be a common defense when member states decide. That means Ireland has a veto. And Ireland cannot sign up to a common defense because as part of the Nice package, before the second referendum on the Nice Treaty in 2002, there was a clause inserted into the Irish Constitution that Ireland would not sign up to a common defence without a referendum. So if you want to have EU common defence, you have to have a referendum in Ireland. And indeed, it may not just be in Ireland, because neutrality is also a constitutional requirement in Austria. Now, neutrality is not a constitutional requirement in Ireland, but signing up to an EU common defence is. In Austria, the neutrality is in the Austrian constitution, so it may create constitutional issues for them as well. It may not just be in Ireland. Well, it used to be the case. Then it's changed recently because it used to. Okay, we'll give you the floor in a second, and you can correct me. But my understanding from my Austrian friends in the MFA is that it is a constitutional issue because it was there from the beginning of the foundation of the Austrian state. But that there would be serious political and constitutional issues for Austria as well. But in the Irish case, the simple answer is you can't have it until all member states agree. And then I don't know what the position of, say, other non-aligned countries like Malta or Cyprus would be on this question. I have to say, I suspect Sweden and Finland would be quite open-minded to the idea. But then the other question would be, would the Americans accept something that's separate from NATO? If you remember when ESDP was born, at that time, it was, the whole CSDP project was very militarily driven, and it was very much influenced in a large degree by the WEU experience, which was a military alliance. In fact, the Brussels Treaty commitment on mutual defence was even stronger than that for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There was an even stricter obligation for the WEU members. And one of the key points for American support for CSDP, ESDP in 1999 was that if the EU ever did become a military alliance, that everyone should be a member of NATO as well, or there should be a clear differentiation. So that would be another complicating factor. Maybe today the Americans don't care as much. Actually, I think they'd be quite happy to see the Europeans improve their ability to deploy and improve their capabilities. I think they'd be quite happy to have a common defence if it really meant that the Europeans could do more and would do more. Because of course, if you remember the 1950s, for the European defence community, actually it was Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who was one of the strongest supporters of the European defence community in the 1950s, and the European defence community was killed in Paris, as you might remember. So there are lots of paradoxes in this debate. And I think I already mentioned, the mutual assistance clause is very open to interpretation, what it really means. But perhaps the more important point is, what do we mean by common defence? Because if you said that member states should de facto cooperate more closely and make more stringent commitments to each other, which is in fact what PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, says, that's not necessarily a problem. The problem is if you think it's creating a military alliance like NATO. So again, it depends a bit on the wording of what we mean and what it is we want to do with that common defence. Because are we talking about something like NATO, which was originally founded to counter the Soviet Union, or are we talking about something that's a bit more holistic? That's a key question. What is the common defence for? What is this homeland defence? Because homeland defence and common defence are not the same thing. I don't think an Irish government would have a problem with homeland defence cooperation, because coping with terrorism or natural disasters is not the same thing as a military threat from a state. And indeed, Ireland has been very supportive of the EU's counter-terrorism efforts, as you would expect, given our own experience with terrorism. So I'm not sure homeland defence would necessarily be a problem. It does depend a lot on how it's presented. But if you're talking about common defence in the old-fashioned Western European Union, Brussels Treaty style, and also as a kind of a political project to create a European army, which is how it sounds to some people, certainly in Ireland and I think in other member states, then that would be problematic. But like I said, every member state has a veto, and I'm just not sure you'd get agreement on what common defence means today. Now, the easy way to answer your second question on the Lithuanian-Irish-Greek triangle is what they should not talk about. And clearly they shouldn't talk about Russia, Turkey, or common defence. No, what I mean, obviously, in the CSDP debate, I think over the coming years, we're going to hear, a lot will depend on the new institutional structure in Brussels. Have we figured out in the External Action Service how these crisis management structures should work? You know, and how does the chain of command work, all those things. That's going to take up a lot of time in Brussels over the next 6 months at least, and maybe longer. We're certainly going to spend some time talking about permanent structured cooperation, which you mentioned, and capabilities in general, although I know there's a lot of skepticism in member states about that. So in other words, we'll talk a lot about process. A lot about process. Now, it seems to me the big problem in the CSDP debate, and this is what I'd like Lithuania, Ireland and Greece to talk about, or to propose that member states discuss, is essentially a white book for European defence. Because what's missing is we do have the European security strategy, which provides a vision for EU foreign policy, and it's a fine vision, an effective multilateralism in particular, and that's fine. But what we lack is something in between, which gives some guidance on how we expect security and defence policy to work following that vision. Because we have all these bottom-up processes, headline goals, the European Defence Agency, etc., 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 for trying to get member states to do things. But it's not clear exactly why we're doing this, or what it is we expect to be doing it for, or what it is we're planning for. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not talking about centralising defence planning in Brussels. Obviously, each member state will continue to do its own defence planning. NATO will do its defence planning. The UN has its own processes. But I do think it would be extremely useful, particularly given the budgetary cuts we all face. Our capabilities will be lucky to keep what we have, at least on the expeditionary side of things. We'll be doing well to be able to keep doing what we're doing, and especially if we want to discuss homeland defence issues as well, I think it would be a very useful process to try and get member states to talk about their strategic level of ambition, if you want, or strategic objectives with EU defence policy, because I think that's lacking, and as a result there's a lack of political guidance, there's a lack of strategic guidance on the future of EU defence policy at the moment. So that's my proposal, but I don't know if every member state would agree with me on that, it has to be said.